Cain Velasquez is considered by many to be the greatest heavyweight that ever lived. He was a former two-time UFC heavyweight champion that seemed unstoppable back in his day. But nowadays, Cain Velasquez is more popular in the mainstream as a wrestler in the WWE. And surprisingly, his UFC run is not as well known to the general audience. So my question is, how good was Cain Velasquez actually? Hey guys, it's Kiiyon, and today I'm going to be talking about the one and only Cain Velasquez. I gotta admit, I really wanted to do a video on Cain after touching up on some of his accomplishments when doing the Brock Lesnar video. And if you haven't seen the Brock Lesnar video, check it out, it's gonna be in the link down below. But right now, let's talk Cain Velasquez, how good he actually was, and where his legacy stands in the sport of MMA. Cain Velasquez, the NCAA Division I All-American from Arizona State, began his MMA career after graduating and began training at American Kickboxing Academy, also known as AKA, under head coach Javier Mendez. He made his debut on October 7, 2006 on a Strikeforce card against Jesse Frujarczyk in Fresno, California. Cain quickly brought the fight to the ground where he finished it with strikes within the first. In his second pro fight, he went to St. Petersburg, Russia to fight Jeremiah Constant, who he defeated 4 minutes into the first round by strikes. After this, Cain Velasquez signed with the UFC and continued the first round finishes when he beat Brad Morris and Jake O'Brien within about 2 minutes in each respective fight. Also, Bruce Buffer introduced Cain as Kiiyon in his debut. I don't know whether it was a mistake or a change later made by Cain, but he will forever be Kiiyon. In early 2009, Cain fought Denis Stojnik in a fight that took him to the second round for the first time in his career. After a first round of stand-up with Denis, Velasquez took the fight down in the second, where he finished the fight with strikes. It wasn't the most exciting finish as per Joe Rogan and probably even the fans, but surprisingly, Cain still earned the knockout of the night bonus. And it's funny because on the same card, Anthony Johnson had an even better finish, but good for Cain. In June of that year, Cain went to Germany where he fought Czech Congo. This was his first fight that went to the judges. And after being rocked early in the first and second round by Congo, Cain went on to dominate the fight with his wrestling and ground and pound. Most importantly, the fight showed that Velasquez was able to take a punch and has impressive cardio for a heavyweight. At UFC 104, Cain fought Ben Rothwell, who he finished in the second round by pinning him to the cage and unleashing a barrage of left hands that looked absolutely brutal. What was even more brutal was the fight after against Minotauro Nogueira in a title eliminator bout. Nogueira was expected to have the advantage on the feet, but after 2 minutes in the fight, Cain executed one of the nicest combos that I've ever seen in an MMA fight that was so fast that you really had to appreciate what he did in the slow-mo. Cain Velasquez earned a shot at the title against then-champion Brock Lesnar. And before that fight, even though Lesnar was the betting favorite, many people believed Cain was going to be the next best heavyweight because he looked unstoppable at this point with his stellar striking and next-level wrestling. So the two finally fought at UFC 121 on October 23, 2010. Brock Lesnar quickly rushed Cain Velasquez and threw some heavy knees, but Cain Velasquez weathered the storm. Even when Lesnar took him down, Cain was able to pop back up at ease. A very tired Brock was taken down himself and received some heavy blows from Velasquez. Even when he was able to get out, Lesnar was spinning out of control due to exhaustion. Cain would continue to pressure Lesnar and eventually finish the fight with strikes on the ground. Cain Velasquez became the baddest man in the world that night, and this only added to the notion that he was going to dominate for a long time. Unfortunately, Velasquez suffered a torn rotator cuff in his right shoulder during his fight with Brock. This meant he would be sidelined for at least 6 to 8 months and was required to have surgery. After being out for a year, Cain Velasquez made his comeback on UFC's first ever event on the Fox network against #1 contender Junior Dos Santos. This was huge because this meant the fight was going to be broadcasted to millions of viewers, most of whom probably never seen an MMA fight. So the stage was big for Cain's comeback. And not only that, he was facing an absolute killer in Junior Dos Santos, who was on a 7-fight win streak in the UFC's heavyweight division prior to fighting Velasquez. But it was a favorable matchup for Cain, who had the wrestling advantage over Dos Santos. But Junior most definitely had the advantage in the striking. And after only 1 minute into the fight, Dos Santos landed a right hook that floored Cain, and that's when he started throwing heavy bombs from the top that stopped the fight. This was a huge upset for Cain Velasquez because, like I said, he was expected to be a dominant champion for a long time. But he lost in his first ever title defense within a minute, which had people thinking that Cain had ring rust, or even worse, he wasn't the same fighter anymore. Afterwards, it was revealed that Cain re-injured his rotator cuff a week prior to the fight. Cain made his comeback 6 months later at UFC 146 when he fought Antonio Bigfoot Silva. If you saw this fight, you would remember how bloody it got after Cain took Bigfoot down and sliced his forehead open with an elbow. Cain would continue to hold Silva down and throw strikes from above, which looked even nastier considering how bloody Bigfoot and the octagon mat were at this point. After 3.5 minutes of beating down Bigfoot, the ref stopped the fight and Cain looked like he just came out of the slaughterhouse. This win was so impressive that Cain became the obvious choice to fight for the belt next against Junior Dos Santos. The rematch took place at UFC 155 on December 29, 2012. Dos Santos, who was actively searching for the KO early, was unable to find success due to Cain's pressure and wrestling. Near the final minute of the first, Velasquez would drop Junior with a right hand and try to finish the fight from there, but Dos Santos was showing so much heart. This moment basically set the tone for the rest of the fight. Cain dominated Dos Santos for 5 rounds by landing 111 significant strikes and 11 takedowns. It was the first time someone posted triple digits in significant strikes and double digits in takedowns in a single fight. Dos Santos was almost unrecognizable and Cain looked unscathed. The judges scored the fight 50-45, 50-44, and 50-43 in favor of the new champion, Cain Velasquez. Cain's first title defense was against Bigfoot Silva, who had a couple of impressive wins after losing to Velasquez in their first fight. But the rematch was even faster than the first, but with less blood. After the first minute into the fight, Cain landed a right hand that dropped Silva. He would go on to finish the fight by strikes shortly after. The same night, rival Junior Dos Santos also earned a win against Mark Hunt, and this made him the obvious choice as the next contender for the heavyweight championship. So the rubber match happened on October 19, 2013 in Houston, Texas. This fight played out very similarly to the second one. Dos Santos was able to get a couple nice shots, but Cain's pressure proved to be too much. Velasquez would land some nice shots of his own and would continuously work Junior against the cage. Going into the fifth, the tired Dos Santos looked unrecognizable again. The fifth round was more of the same from Cain, and with 2 minutes remaining in the fight, Junior would attempt a standing submission, but Velasquez was able to get out of it and in the process, flipped Dos Santos face first into the mat. A tired and dazed Junior remained on the floor until Cain finished the fight with strikes. It was Cain's second title defense and it really seemed like no one was able to stop Velasquez anytime soon. But the biggest issue in Cain's career at this point were injuries. He was constantly getting injured and a lot of the blame was going towards the American Kickboxing Academy, who at this point were known to train really hard, and as a result, this would injure a lot of their fighters. He was set to defend the belt for a third time against Fabricio Werdum on November 15, 2014. But he pulled out of the fight due to a torn meniscus and a sprained MCL. This injury sidelined Cain for the entire 2014 year. He made his comeback on June 20th, 2016 at UFC 188 where he fought Fabricio Werdum, who captured the interim championship 7 months prior. What's notable about this fight is that it was in Mexico City, which meant it was a huge homecoming for the Mexican Cain Velasquez. He was one of the biggest stars in Latin America by now, and this would also be the first time he ever fought in Mexico. Fighting in Mexico City was a huge factor, not only going into the fight, but even during it as well. Let me explain. Mexico City sits at a high altitude, and when you're in a place of higher elevation, breathing becomes more difficult. Challenger Fabricio Werdum prepared for this by flying out to Mexico 6 weeks prior to the fight so he could acclimate his body. Cain Velasquez did the same, but only 2 weeks prior to the fight. When the fight went down, Velasquez was able to knock down Fabricio quick and from there, use his pressure to smother Werdum against the cage and pick him apart with some strikes. But as the round went on, Cain was becoming sloppier with his striking and getting tagged more with shots by Werdum. This narrative would continue into the second round and into the start of the third. In this round, an exhausted Cain would dive in for a desperation takedown which would lead to his demise. Werdum, who was a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, locked in the guillotine choke that forced Cain to tap. It was a very hard moment on Cain, I could imagine. He imposed his game plan of implementing high pressure, but it was ineffective because it gassed him out so quickly. And Cain was known to have a great gas tank. I mean, he was known as Cardio Cain. But in this fight, he got exhausted, and as much as I'd like to blame it on the high altitude, I have to give credit to Fabricio Werdum, who fought a really good fight. Regardless, this event spawned so many C-level Cain memes in the MMA world. And even though a rematch was set for February 6, 2016, both fighters pulled out due to injury, which meant Cain had another year-long layoff rehabbing injuries. He came back in July of 2016 when he fought Travis Brown at UFC 200. And if there's any reason to believe that Cain wasn't himself in the last fight due to the high altitude, his performance on this night was a good reason as to why, because he bounced back in an incredible way. After dominating Travis Brown throughout the round with his pressure, wrestling, and striking, he went on to get the buzzer beater finish when the ref stopped the fight on the ground with only 3 seconds left after Travis Brown was unable to defend himself from the vicious ground and pound. Cain Velasquez was back, and the obvious fight to make next was the rematch against Fabricio Werdum. And it was supposed to happen on December 30th, 2016 at UFC 207, but Cain was pulled from that fight because the Nevada State Athletic Commission failed to approve him. The reason as to why was an interview Cain had with ESPN's Brett Okamoto, and where he admitted that he could barely stand straight for 10 minutes. Yeah, that was not a good thing to say 6 days prior to your fight. This led to the commission to further analyze Cain's physical examinations. They found that Cain had bone spurs on his back, which is the formation of new bone on the surface bone. The commission pulled Velasquez from the match due to him being unfit to fight. It was a decision that Cain was upset about, but respected. Following this, Cain Velasquez took an extended break from MMA to get surgery on his back, rehabilitate his nagging injuries, and most importantly, be a father to his family. And after 2.5 years away from the sport, Cain Velasquez was finally making his comeback in 2019 against a new face in the heavyweight division. That man was Francis Ngannou. Francis, who was just coming off of a 45-second knockout win 3 months prior, looked as dangerous as ever. But it was a favorable matchup for Cain on paper, who had the wrestling advantage. But instead of going for the takedown immediately, Velasquez stood in the face of Ngannou, throwing some kicks to start off. Francis pressed forward, and as Cain retaliated by adding some pressure of his own, he got clipped by a right hand on the chin, and this had him buckle on his right knee, the same one he would have surgery on years prior. He immediately fell to the mat and covered up before the ref stepped in to stop Ngannou's monstrous attacks. The fight lasted 26 seconds. In the post-fight interview, Cain apologized for his performance and said he will be back as soon as he's all good. But that was the last time we saw Cain Velasquez fight in MMA. At the age of 37, he would announce his retirement on October 11, 2019, after expressing that he wanted to focus on his career in professional wrestling. I mean, at least we get to see Cain vs. Brock Part 2, right? So after going 14-3 in the sport of mixed martial arts, and a career where he was a 2-time UFC heavyweight champion, the question we ask now is, how good was Cain Velasquez actually? So this may be crazy to hear, but I think Cain Velasquez was the greatest heavyweight of all time. And I get it, we have greats like Fedor, Stipe, and DC, but Cain was on another level in his prime. When he won his fights decisively by absolutely beating down on his opponents. Cain was one of the fastest heavyweights I've ever seen, and he was a master at swarming his opponents with his elite striking and high-level wrestling. He was a complete fighter, and that was rarely seen amongst heavyweights in MMA. But unfortunately, his biggest opponent were his injuries. And I truly believe if he never got injured, we would unanimously be referring to him as the greatest heavyweight of all time. But even with the injuries and setbacks, it's hard for me to ignore the sheer dominance that was displayed by Cain Velasquez. My name is Kiiyon, and this was my take on how good Cain Velasquez actually was. Do you agree, disagree, or have something else to add? Please put it in the comments down below because I'd love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. But that's all I have for now, so I'll see you in my next one.